All right. Good evening, everybody. I'm Susan M. Hart-Servideo from the Rutgers Cooperative Extension in Ocean County. And with us tonight is Patty Dixon, who is also a horticulturist in Ocean County. And our speaker tonight is do you call it William Lubick?
Bill,
okay, Bill from Middlesex County, and you are the Ag and Natural Resource agent there, and a lot more. And you said you were doing your new getting ready to farm on a smaller scale program.
Yes. Starting. Beginner farmer program called "Are You Ready to Farm" for the state of New Jersey. So anybody who has any interest in going beyond doing gardening and wants to be part of our program, we have this program is full for this year, but if you're interested, contact Susan or myself and we'll get you in touch with my coordinator and we can get you in next year's class.
And then for any rules, not really rules, but on the program tonight, the attendance videos and microphones and the chat feature is turned off. So please use the Q&A section to ask your questions. You won't see the questions until Patty or myself answer them, but we will just make sure you direct it to all panelists instead of doing it individually to Patty or myself separately, because that way we can both answer questions as we go. And Bill will stop as we need it, and we'll go from there. So Bill, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you.
Okay, thanks, Susan and Patty. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. Our topic tonight for in the Know to Grow is fall lawn care rescue. And we're going to give you some handy tips that are going to help you for this time of the year to be able to get your lawn looking back like you want it to look, hopefully. And let's get started. And as Susan said, I work with Rutgers Cooperative Extension, the New Jersey Agricultural Experiment Station. I teach undergraduate classes at Rutgers University. I work with master gardeners, work with farmers on all different aspects of food production, plant pathology, and genetics. And we did develop 2 new strawberries called the Rutgers Scarlet and Rutgers Delight, which is coming out next year, that you'll see released through Indiana Berry. So if you have any interest in trying that new strawberry, look in the Indiana Berry catalog if you have any inkling to do that. So let's talk about lawn care and some things we can do this time of the year to really get our lawns looking great or getting back into shape. Lawns are really starting, as it starts to get cooler in the fall, we see lawns will start to bounce back a little bit. And you'll see that it's a perfect time to do renovation, to do overseeding this time of the year, to really get that lawn looking a little bit better for the following spring. So that's why we're talking about it right now, because fall lawn care, this is the best time to fertilize, to make sure that we're out there controlling certain types of weeds for next year, and great time to overseed. So we're going to talk about all those things. And when we talk about landscapes, we have to kind of look at what our expectations are for landscapes, because each of us has a different expectation in terms of what's allowable and what's not allowable. And, there are many people that have allowed clovers to be in lawns, and clovers are not actually a bad thing to have in lawns. And that's because in many areas, clovers can help fix nitrogen. They have very deep root systems. They're able to really work in sync with our lawn grasses to capture moisture, to break up compact soils, and to capture nitrogen from the air and to share it with the plants around them. But not everybody wants clover in lawns, so people try to fight it. But if you're one of those that likes clover, clover is really not such a bad thing to have in your lawn. But many weeds are indicator plants. If you have more weeds than you have grass, then it's telling you that either your pH or soil acidity is off. So it's not, usually we want our pH of most lawn areas to be between about 6.2 to 6.5. It can even be 6.0, and your lawn will do fine with that. And so how do you figure that out? Well, you take a soil test. And I'm sure you've talked in your other classes here about taking soil tests, but this is a perfect time of the year to take a soil test, and you can send it off to the Rutgers lab and contact your local cooperative extension office to find out how you send your soil samples in to be tested by Stephanie Murphy and her group at the Rutgers Soil Testing Office. And weeds indicate that the pH could be off. It indicates there could be compaction problems. And normally compaction problems are the problem. And we can have compaction even on sandy and sandy loam soils, believe it or not. And we can have compaction, of course, on clay and clay loam soils. So no matter what type of soil you have, when you go out and you do a little digging to get your soil samples, you can tell whether or not your shovel or your spade or your soil sampler can actually get down, 6 to 8 inches to get your soil sample. And if you're having problems getting that to dig down that far, then you probably have some compaction problems. So we're going to tell you what you can do today to alleviate some of those problems. And what I tell people is to work with the conditions that they have. In this particular landscape, you can see that the lawn grasses start to fade away when you get into the shadier areas. And that's natural because most of our lawn grasses for the Northeast are cool season grasses, and they really do not like to grow in the shade. And you'll see they'll start to fade, and you'll have other plants like liriope and hostas and plants that love the shade that will flourish in those areas. And really, that's what you should grow in those areas instead of trying to grow turf grass, because turf grass struggles where you have deep or intense shade. And in those areas, use mulch as much as you can to help save the trees, to help protect the roots of those plants, and help them to be able to adapt to those conditions a little bit better, especially when we have dry spells. So learning to work with the conditions that you have, making sure that you're testing the soil all around your landscape so that you know it could change from your front lawn to your back lawn to other areas where you have ericaceous plants like rhododendrons and azaleas. You may have treated it differently in terms of the type of fertilizers and the acidity of the fertilizers that you're putting down. So you want to make sure you get those soil tests done, and it explains online exactly how to do that. And if you have questions on it, we could talk about that later. I like to say to people to introduce as many native and pest-resistant plants to their landscape as possible. And what that means in terms of your lawn is make sure that you're growing 2 or 3 different types of lawn varieties. And most of the mixes that you see that are commercial mixes are going to have more than one variety of turf grass in that. And the reason for that is because that provides resistance to certain disease and insect problems. And if you can, also look for grasses that contain endophytes, which are beneficial fungi that live within the grass that provide resistance to certain insects. And we found recently, especially with fine fescues, that it can give us some disease resistance as well. So and I'll have a slide on that to explain it. I just have one slide, I believe, on the fertilizer law. Just remember that you can do fertilization in the fall. And for most consumers, that means that you can fertilize up through November 15th. And after that period of time through March 1st, we do not recommend that consumers do fertilization. Professionals can go out there a little bit later using different formulations and really kind of targeting their applications. But you also don't want to fertilize before you have any frost or before any rainfall, because if you're adding fertilizers to areas that are not going to accept the fertilizer, it can wash off on an impervious surface and end up contaminating water. And we want to reduce the amount of nitrogen to 0.7 pounds of actual nitrogen per 1,000 square foot. So that's just something that is a golden rule of thumb to try to follow so we don't contaminate. Oh, here it is. I do have another slide. So no more than 0.7 pounds of water-soluble nitrogen per 1,000 square foot application. The total nitrogen should not exceed 0.9 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square foot per each application. But this is a good time of year as we get into September that you can put down a fertilizer application if you need it and you see the lawn is struggling. And you can also put down one more if you need to, and about a month and a half from now. But the total application of nitrogen for the year should not exceed 3.2 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 square feet. So that's just a rule of thumb that we use. And if you're recycling grass clippings back onto the lawn, you do not need to add that third application of fertilizer and you will be fine because you're adding fertilizer back through the grass clippings. And grass clippings do not contribute to thatch. They actually help your lawn all throughout the season. So that's a good thing to do. So we talked about recycling grass clippings. We can actually top dress lawns with compost, especially when we get into the latter part of the season and the grass is regrowing. We can use an 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch of compost if we have it to add more organic matter, along with recycling grass clippings that are cut very short. We can also use compost to mulches around trees and shrubs to help protect the tree and shrub and to add valuable nutrients back to those plants. And we want to slowly recycle nutrients back to turf grass and back to trees and shrubs, because if we add too much fertilizer at any one time, we increase growth to the point where we can exacerbate or increase the amount of disease and insect problems that we have on our plants within that landscape. And we can also reduce water use and reduce disease problems by watering deeply and infrequently, watering late at night and early in the morning. So what that does is that gets that penetration of irrigation water early in the morning when we need it, allows it to sink into the soil down to the root system. Or we can also use trickle irrigation in our other beds in the garden. We can mulch around plants to help conserve moisture. And in areas where we cannot get water to those areas, we can grow plants with a deeper root system, especially with turf grass. We can select the turf type tall fescues or the fine fescues, and they have very deep root systems. So what they'll be able to do is they can go 2 to 3 times the depth to find the water in those areas. If you are not planning on doing any irrigation and you want drought tolerant plants, definitely look for the fescue type grasses. And we always are promoting IPM in all of our programs in cooperative extension because it stands for Integrated Pest Management. And it means that we're using all these great techniques, including some of the renovation work that I'm going to explain, in order to keep plants healthy and happy and use all the technology and management practices that we can to reduce unnecessary use of pesticides. So that may mean that we look for a pest at a certain stage. Like for instance, if we're trying to control certain types of beetles and grubs, then we know that August is the best time to control many of our white grub complex by adding biological materials in August. And by using the biological controls in August, we're actually controlling the first most susceptible instar of those grubs, and we can get the best effect or the biggest bang for our buck by using both contact and biological controls throughout the month of August. If we wait too much later than that, the insects will be at a later stage and they will be less susceptible to the products that you're going to use. So let's look at some of the basic principles. If we're going to try to have healthy turf grass, avoid densely shaded areas. And if you have dense shade, then grow ground covers and other types of plants, or use mulch around trees and shrubs. And don't try to grow turf grass, especially the cool season turf grasses, because they do not like shade and they will have struggle if they're in heavily shaded areas. Avoid steep slopes with areas that you know you're going to have to mow. So if you grow dwarf type fescues, they will work, or grow other types of plants that do not need as much care. So you don't have to put yourself out on the edge of properties and put yourself at risk mowing those areas. So the basic needs of turf grass anywhere is we need a lot of sunlight. And if we have moderate to dense shade, we're going to have problems. So we want to plant ground covers in those areas that are adapted to shade in those conditions. Another thing that we absolutely must have is fertile, well-drained soils, because many of our cool season grasses do not like to be in areas where it's too wet. If they get wet feet, the grasses will struggle. They will get diseases like Pythium that will come in, take over those areas and become problematic and move out from those wet areas into healthy areas. So we always want to improve the drainage. And you'll know if a field is well drained, because if it hasn't rained in weeks and you get a rainfall of an inch or two, usually that rain should disappear within a couple of hours. And if it's still puddling out there, then you may need to take some action to alleviate the buildup of excessive rainfall in those areas. So we talked about proper pH or proper soil acidity, and that's extremely important for turf grasses, because if we have a proper pH, then we know that the turf grass and trees and shrubs and our vegetables are going to be happy. If they're non-ericaceous type plants, they're going to be able to absorb nutrients more readily from the soil and have a better conversion by the soil bacteria and other microorganisms. Otherwise, if the pH is too low, if it's down in the 5s or up in the 7s or 8s, we may have a problem with turf grass and certain types of trees and even vegetable plants absorbing nutrients. Then we want to make sure we have adequate moisture, but not excessive moisture. And where you have turf grass, if it has competition from shallow rooted trees, that can cause a problem. But, I always say, save your trees and your shrubs are the most important. So mulch around your trees and shrubs and don't worry about the turf grass. Turf grass shouldn't be growing underneath the trees and shrubs anyway. Get some other plants that are better adapted to those conditions and mulches. So one thing you can do this time of the year, so we're going to get right into some things you can do, is seeding. You can do overseeding. And before you do overseeding this time of the year, that's the time where you take your mowing height down below the 3 inches that we normally recommend. So for most of the year, most of the growing season, you want to have your lawn mower deck set so it's mowing at 3 to 3.5 inches high. And you do not want to go lower than that. And the reason for that is because these grasses grow best under those conditions. So the only time that we will cut that lawn lower than that or mow it closer to the ground is when we're seeding, when we're doing any kind of core aeration, or we're doing dethatching. That's when we want to bring the mower height down in September, maybe to about an inch, inch and a half. And that's when we go out and we can do core aeration, decompaction with the dethatching machine. And we can go ahead after we're done all those things and we've smoothed out the area, we can go ahead and add fertilizer and lime, and we can also put seed down at the same time. So seeding is best done in the late summer, early fall. So we're exactly at the right time. So this is a opportune class because now is the time to do all these things in this area. Spring is the second best time to do seeding because we have more weed competition. So we literally have tens to thousands of weed seeds germinating in the springtime. So we're going to be competing with all of those winter annuals and summer annuals coming in as well, coming up during that time of the year. So it's best to really go in this time of the year to start to do our seeding. And the overseeding means that we'll get a machine that's it's pictured here in the top picture. And simply what it is, it cuts grooves after you've mowed the lawn close, right before you're getting ready to seed. It cuts grooves in the lawn almost like a dethatcher and allow those seeds to drop down into those holes. And then you can water the seed in afterwards. And you can even use a little bit of mulch after you've done overseeding. And I typically will recommend overseeding if you've had a lawn that's a little bit thin, it's thinned out in certain areas, or you want to put in some better seed that has endophytes in it and get some better quality seed established in what you have. And it will actually tell you right on the seed bag of how to set that overseeder. And you can rent these overseeders from Lowe's, Home Depot, Ace. A lot of rental stores will have these overseeder units. And it tells you how to set the overseeder unit. So it's just going right down below the thatch and cutting right into the soil, and then it's dropping the seed so it has good contact with the soil. And then after you've done that, you can go ahead and spread a little peat moss or other types of organic materials very thinly over the surface of that. Or simply, if you don't have any other materials, just go ahead and irrigate those seeds in, but don't overdo it with the irrigation so that you wash the seed out. And you want to select high quality seed varieties, and I'm going to show you where you can go to find those high quality seed varieties. So I'm sure that everybody's seeding area looks exactly like this when they get ready to seed. And this is from one of the research plots up at Rutgers. And this is a pretty old machine. I think it's seen better days, but it's one that they use to basically set up the area where they're going to seed their research plots. So they have already taken their soil test. They've pulled out any of the pre-existing turf, and you can do that by either using a tarp over the area to kill everything, or you could use Roundup. You just have to follow your directions, to the letter on the label, and then pull out the existing turf that's there or weeds that are there. And then make sure you have a nice smooth seed bed. Now, this is only if you're starting over completely. For overseeding, you don't have to do this. For overseeding, you're just going to mow low, and you're going to use that overseeder that I showed you right in your existing turf grass. So you'll use less seed for that than you would for complete renovation. So this is where somebody ran into a situation where the whole lawn looked so horrible and they had nothing but weeds. So they decided, okay, let's kill everything that's here. Let's start over from ground zero. Let's take a soil test. Let's adjust the pH to 6.2 to 6.5, add a little bit of fertilizer, go ahead and prepare it. We're going to go ahead and seed inside of this area. We're going to follow the label directions on the seed packet to either use an overseeder or a spin spreader, rotary spreader. And then go ahead and just rake over that lightly. You just want to rake over areas that you've seeded lightly so that you cover it. Otherwise, you're going to have every bird in the entire neighborhood and every neighborhood nearby coming to eat your seed. So when we used to seed at the research stations, we would get out there to seed and it would look like the Alfred Hitchcock movie, The Birds, where all the birds would line up on all the electric wires and they would wait for us to seed. And unfortunately, we kind of destroyed their happiness by covering over some of the seed to make it a little bit harder for them to get to it. You could also use a little bit of peat moss or compost if you had just a very, very thin layer, like 1/8 of an inch, or you could use some straw. If you had good, clean rye straw that was clean and didn't have any seeds in it, you could also put that over this area to protect it from the birds and keep it moist so that the seed would germinate. Normally, your seed will germinate in about 7 to 10 days. When you have mixes of seed, your rye seed will come up first, and then your bluegrass and other types of fescues will come up into the second week and the following weeks to get established. And after you've seeded, you want to keep that area moist. After you've overseeded, you also want to keep the area moist for the next 2 to 3 weeks by irrigating at least once a day, 1/4 to 1/2 inch of water, unless you get natural rainfall. So this is what it looks like when you've got a good stand of seed. This is about how dense it typically is, whether you're seeding bluegrass or fescues. And then you'll see it to the right that the seed will come up in about 7 days. The different types of ryegrass, usually they're the largest seed. They will be the first ones to emerge, but they're of a lower percentage in the seed mix because the ryegrass comes up, establishes the area so that the soil doesn't wash away, and then your better quality fescue and bluegrass seeds will eventually take over. And especially where you guys are near the ocean, you want deep-rooted grasses that will survive a little bit better. So some of the better grasses for you are going to be the turf-type tall fescues and the fine fescues because they have a much deeper root system. And this just gives you an idea of the seeding rates that For Kentucky bluegrass, you use 1 to 2 pounds of Kentucky blue per 1,000 square foot. Use a higher amount of perennial ryegrass, but it's a much larger seed. And tall fescue, use about 6 to 10 pounds per 1,000 square foot. And when you have mixes, they're already pre-mixed, so that when you put them in your spreader, they're going to automatically be spread. And if you have any questions, if it looks like the seed has not been mixed properly, just go ahead and shake those bags up a little bit before you put it in the seeder to make sure that it's evenly distributed before you go out and seed those areas. Fine fescue is about 4 to 5 pounds per 1,000 square foot. For areas where you've got lighter soils where it's going to drain quicker, you probably want to go with the fescues being where their root systems go down 3 and 4 times the depth, because they're going to have better longevity over a bluegrass that has very shallow root systems. So those are some of the things that might help you in trying to establish a new lawn. And then here you got to watch with these covers that when the grass starts to come up, you take them off, but you don't pull the grass out, because as the grass starts to grow through the cover and you lift that cover up, you could actually pull out the grass. And here they've used some straw in the picture to the right, and that's a little bit more straw than I would put down for those areas. I would put it a lot thinner than that. But what will happen is if you put the right amount of straw and cover down, it'll hold the moisture in, and then the grass will grow up through that. Just don't put it more than 1/8 of an inch thick or more, and that will break down in those areas.
Bill, we do have, before you get into sod, there were a couple of seed questions that came up. And I just thought it might be a good stopping point as you
Okay.
get moving. We did have quite a few questions about seed for shade, which you went over on your first couple slides there. But so people wanted to know, should you seed and fertilize a damp, wet, or dry lawn? Should the ground be?
Yes, so you can. I mean, when you go out to seed, typically you want to make sure that, especially if you're using an overseeder, that the machine can work properly. So it's fine if it's a little bit damp. If it's really moist, you probably don't want to go out there with heavy equipment, because you're going to compact your soil. So I always say to people, if your soil is wet, you probably want to stay off of it, in terms of doing any kind of renovation. So typically we renovate when there's just a little tiny bit of moisture, but it's not overly moist or overly dry. If it's too dry, you're going to have problems when you're doing renovation work, that it's going to destroy the machine that's doing the renovation work. And if it's too wet, it's going to tear up the grass that's there and tear up and compact your soil too much. So a little bit of moisture is good. It's better to go a little bit on the dry side and then irrigate afterwards, if that helps. And then grasses that will tend to do better if you have partial shade, the fine fescues, anything with a fine blade is going to do much better than anything with a wider blade, because the fine fescues can tolerate partial shade. But what you want to do is, if you are growing in grasses in partial shade, you want to mow them even higher. So you would go 3.5 to 4 inches. You would also cut back on your fertilizer, because one way to destroy grass in the shade is to cut it too low. And another way to destroy it is to over fertilize it, because it doesn't need as much fertilizer in the shade. So those are 2 tips that can help you grow healthier turf grass in the shade. And look for fine fescues that have endophytes in them. Endophytes is a beneficial fungus that lives in the seed. That answer the question?
Yep. Two questions. One, the shady part. What do you define as your shade? I mean, I know for garden areas it's a little different, but for grass, I shouldn't say different. But
well,
what do you define as shade?
If deep shade is where you don't have any, if full sun doesn't penetrate that area at any part of the day, if you don't get direct sunlight, at least for 1 or 2 hours of the day, then it's not a good area to grow any of our cool season grasses. But what you'll even see in the forest a lot of times, or you'll see in areas where you've got trees and you've got sun. The grasses tend to inhabit areas where the sun is able to sneak in for at least part of the day. And where in forested areas where you don't get any sun, typically there's other ground covers that just completely take over. So practice the same thing that nature does, where you do not get any direct sunlight at any time of the day. Just hang it up with the trying to grow grass there and grow ground covers that are to those areas.
Yeah.
Now, yeah, sure. Thanks. Any other questions?
There is another seed question here. Someone asked, what is the difference between coated seeds and regular naked seeds in terms of maintaining as natural a lawn as possible?
So some coated seeds can have different substrates on them. They could have fertilizer, encapsulated fertilizer, or other materials that will absorb moisture and keep it right around the seed. Now, you're going to pay a lot more money for coated seed. Do you need coated seed? No. Will it help you in your trying to establish it? It could, but sometimes I think you're better off buying high quality seed and spending money on better quality seed than buying the coated seed. But if you don't have a green thumb and you've always had problems establishing your grass, maybe you do want to spend more money for coated seed. So what it has on it is sometimes it'll have a fertilizer component on it. It'll have a moisture wicking opportunity on it so that when you wet it, it stays wet longer and the seed will establish much faster, but it is a lot more expensive. And also it's to me, it's more important that I get the variety I want more so than whether the seed is coated, because I want to make sure I have good, and I'll talk about that in a minute, how you get really good varieties. So for sod, as we get into sod, you can put down sod over the summer, the spring, the fall. You have a wider range of time you can put down the sod. The caveat is that you still need to prepare the soil and the pH, and it's going to cost you a lot more to put down sod. But if you're a real estate agent and you need a lawn to look good pretty darn quick, or you're selling your house, some people will tear up everything they've got, put down sod. You have to continually water that for about 3 to 4 weeks until the root systems grow down into the soil. You also have to, where you're using sod, make sure that if you do it or someone does it for you, that they prepare that sod bed like you see here, where there's bare soil. We've had people put sod down on top of existing grass. Not a good idea, because the sod doesn't get established and you've just wasted your money on all that sod. And make sure that the sod varieties that they're using are certified by Rutgers. And they're supposed to follow seed sod certification standards. So there is a fact sheet that we put out through Rutgers called Seed Sod Certification Standards. Try saying that 3 times fast. And what that is it means that these varieties have been tested by Rutgers, by Cornell, by Penn State, and they do very well in our area. So look for that in the seed they're bringing out. And also ask questions with these landscapers. You know, that's why you're in these courses, so that you can learn from cooperative extension. You can ask better questions and you're in the know. And you've got so many wonderful master gardeners you can turn to on the helplines in each county to help you answer questions. So the cool season turf grasses are the ones that we focus on in our area. So that's excluding zoysia grass. I'm not talking about zoysia grass today, but if we have any comments towards the end, I can tell you a little bit about it. So cool season grasses are going to be the bluegrass. It's going to be the fescues. It's going to be the turf type tall fescues. It's going to be ryegrass. And the best thing about these grasses is that they can tolerate our cold winters and our somewhat warm summers. If it gets too warm in the summertime, they sometimes struggle, but they are able to survive under the extreme conditions. So what we do at the university, at Rutgers University, is we test all of these grasses. We literally test hundreds and hundreds of varieties every year. And then I'm going to show you where we post that information so you can learn about the latest information out there. This chart shows you that the most active part of the grass growth is in the springtime for both the tops and the roots. and also in the fall. So that's why they're called cool season grasses, because even though they're growing fine during July and August, that's not their favorite time of the year. Their time where they're the most physiologically active and growing at their best is usually late August through October and beginning of November until we get some pretty significant frost. And then they'll start to grow again in April all the way up through June, and they're pretty happy at those times. So that's why we put down most of our fertilizer in mid to late September and October, because the root systems are growing, they're actively taking up those nutrients, and then that's turning into a healthy plant for the following season. So the cool season grasses of significance are the Kentucky blues, the fine fescues, including hard fescue, creeping red fescue, and chewing fescue, and the turf-type tall fescues and perennial ryegrass. Now, for a low-maintenance lawn for areas that you guys are in, I would probably focus on the fine fescue types and the turf-type tall fescues that have very deep root systems, because the Kentucky blue tends to have a more shallow-rooted system, and therefore, when you have dry conditions and you have sandier soils, it's going to dry out much faster. And perennial ryegrass typically needs to be overseeded on a regular basis, requires more mowing, and that's mainly used as a grass for turf fields where we have a lot of sports activities going on. So if you do a lot of overseeding, or you have a lot of traffic in an area where you're constantly overseeding through the spring through the fall, then you would grow something like a perennial ryegrass in those areas. And grasses for low maintenance, and these would be low maintenance. It also includes soils that are rapid drainers, like the sandier type soils. So you would look for the fine fescues, the strong creeping red, the chewings, and the hard fescues and tall fescues, and avoid the Kentucky bluegrasses. I probably would not recommend perennial ryegrasses for the shore area, because they tend to struggle in those areas and have more problems with red thread disease, and they require more inputs in those areas. We also mentioned that endophytes are a good thing to have in your grass. Well, fortunately, the turf-type fescues and the fine fescues and many of the ryegrasses actually have these endophytes. What they are is they're beneficial fungi that live in the seed, and then they grow along. The top picture that you see is actually the endophyte, the beneficial fungus, living in the top portions of the grass and providing protection of that grass to surface feeding insects, and in the case of fine fescues, actually giving it some resistance to certain diseases as well. So endophytes are a good thing to have in the grass, and if you look online and look on the seed packet, sometimes it will say contains endophytes. Or we'll say contains a beneficial fungus, and that beneficial fungus is the endophyte that's protecting it from problems. So if you can buy grasses that contain endophytes. So they can provide insect resistance and act as a natural insecticide. They can improve drought tolerance. And we've shown in recent research that in fine fescues, they can actually improve resistance to dollar spot, red thread disease, and summer patch disease in turfgrass. So it's just a good thing to have natural. Here you can see where chinch bug damage, same exact variety of grass. The one on the right has endophytes, the one on the left does not. But you can see the level of protection offered by just having endophytic turfgrass there growing it. And here's where it's protecting grasses from dollar spot, which is a fungal disease problem. On the right, we have endophytes. It's the same exact variety in this creeping red fescue. And on the left, we don't have it because the seed was improperly stored, so the endophyte did not survive. And therefore, so you can see there's dramatic differences with grasses, so it's good to look for that. The texture of grass is quite different. The fine fescues, of course, has a finer leaf blade, so that's why it can do better under partial shade conditions. Whereas Kentucky bluegrass, you let it grow out, it forms a boat-shaped leaf, and then even a larger blade than that would be the turf-type tall fescues. So you can see the grasses are different in terms of their texture. And I'm going to get through this because we've already talked about these guys. I just want to show you that we do have listings on our Rutgers sites for different types of hard fescues that are out there. And if you look on our websites, we will actually show you the ones that are listed out there that are pretty tough varieties, like Beacon and Firefly and Reliant and Nordic and Rescue and Predator and Blu-ray. And what that means is that these varieties will survive better under less inputs of fertilizer, under less water. They're pretty tough grasses. They're pretty tough hard fescues. So in your area, these would be good grasses to give a try. But I'll also send you to a much larger list that you can look up while you're in Home Depot or Lowe's or wherever you go, and you can look to see if the grasses you have are there. So we do studies to see how these different grasses tolerate partial shade to full shade. And like I said, many of the grasses do not love full shade. But the turf type tall fescues, there's a lot of them. And of course, many of you have seen these when you go into, you've seen the Rebel varieties, the Falcon varieties in the store. I've seen Mustang and Firecracker in stores out there now on Millennium. So just look for some of these varieties, and then you'll know that you'll have good varieties that will perform well. I also like Rembrandt a lot, but all of these varieties were some of the top varieties that we found on our list. And we can provide this, I don't know if copies are provided to the group, or they can come back and view this at a later recording and read off some of these, but these are some of the best varieties that we've found. And then for Kentucky Blue, if you insist on trying to go Kentucky Blue, even though it's really not a low maintenance grass, there are some good ones on there, like Cabernet, Ara, Zinfandel for the mid-Atlantic types, Midnight. You want to avoid Midnight too in shady areas, but the regular Midnight will actually grow moderately well in shady areas. And more compact type of low maintenance Kentucky bluegrasses like Diva, Bewitched, P105. I've grown these out at our site and they've done extremely well. So those are in the top three categories. Those are some of our favorites that have done extremely well, and you can find them in different grass mixes. So you want to select best quality cool season grasses, and you can look towards this list. NTEP is where you find them, National Turf Grass Evaluation Program. So if you look on your cell phone when you're out looking for grasses and you go on www.ntep.org, you're going to navigate in there and you will find grasses that we've tested at Rutgers and Cornell, and you'll find them, the different types of Kentucky Blue and fine fescues, and the ones that we've had the best luck on in our research trial. So you can get a lot of information on that site. And now let's talk about a little bit about watering, and then we're going to get into renovation in the last 15 minutes. So turf needs about 1 inch to 1.5 inches of water per week, whether it's getting rainfall or whether you're putting top irrigation on that. And you don't want to overdo it, because if you overdo the watering and you irrigate late in the day, you're going to increase disease problems, and then you're going to have die out in your turf from diseases like Pythium eventually. Mowing, we want to make sure we keep those mower blades sharp. You want to mow at 3 inches or higher. Do not bring those grass blades lower to the ground unless you want problems, because when we mow the grass too low, we have a lot of problems with the meristem, which is at the base of the plant. So if you want your grass to stay healthy, you want to mow it at 3 to 3.5 inches. The only time you bring that mowing height down is when you're overseeding, or you're doing coring or aeration or doing renovation, and we're going to get into that next. Keep your mower blade sharp at all times. You can do that yourself or have somebody do it. Make sure that if you're going to do it yourself, you do it safely, and work with somebody, and make sure you put a block on there and take the spark plug wire off. You want to recycle your grass clippings because that keeps your lawn healthy. It's a great slow release source of nitrogen, and it helps your lawn to stay green later in the year and green up earlier in the season. And let's get into, I'm going to want to get into the renovation. So fertilization, we can do it this time of the year, and fertilization is going to be based on your soil tests that are coming back. But you can also do fertilization after you've done renovation. Many of you are asking about renovation and asking about liming as well. Liming can be done this time of the year. It can be done anytime in the spring or the fall where you have active growth. It can even be done during the summertime. but make sure you base any liming or fertilization based on your soil test. Now let's get into lawn renovation because I want to spend some time on that. Now renovation is important this time of the year because what you're doing is you're basically improving those lawns. You're improving oxygen, water penetration, fertilizer penetration down into the root systems of the plants. So you're rejuvenating worn out lawns, you're increasing water penetration, excess thatch is being removed, and we're going to talk about how to do that in a second here. So here's the thatch, and if you follow the grass blade down to where it goes from being the dark green to lighter colored to down into the crown tissue or the base of the plant, below that you see the thatch, and the thatch is some living as well as dead rhizomes, roots, and crown tissue. And if that gets more than a ½ inch in thickness, then you need to use a dethatching machine this time of year. So that's when we would cut our lawn lower to the ground. So we would cut it at about an inch high. We would go in there with a dethatching machine or a dethatching rake. If you have a small lawn, you can use a dethatching rake. We would go in there, remove some of that thatch all the way down so we have soil coming to the surface, and do it in 2 different directions, and try to get the thatch down to about a ½ inch or less in thickness. And what that's going to do is that's going to allow oxygen and water and nutrients to get down to those roots, and the roots are actually below that thatch layer. So we need to actually provide penetration of oxygen, nutrients, and moisture down to the roots. So if we have a ½ inch or less of thatch, we're in good shape. If we have more than a ½ inch, if it's over an inch, you're going to have to rent a dethatching machine or get a good solid dethatching rake. And you want to do that this time of the year and remove that thatch. You don't want to keep it on the lawn. You want to take it off and put that in your compost pile because that can accumulate. So what causes thatch? Over fertilization, poor soil pH. If you're overwatering, you'll have too much thatch build up because it's literally killing some of your grass and grass components. Or if you're overusing pesticides, you'll see an excess in thatch buildup. How do you know if you have too much thatch? Well, you just simply go out with a trowel and you do a little bit of digging and you determine if it's more than a ½ inch in thickness. If you walk on the lawn and the lawn seems too spongy in areas, those are the areas you want to test, because if it's too spongy when you're walking on it, then the chances are that probably the thatch is too thick. So you want to look at those areas. And here's a dethatching machine. It can be done this time of the year, all the way through mid-October. And we want to adjust the dethatching knives or go down there with a rake, a hand rake, so we're going all the way down and bringing a little bit of soil to the surface. And you'll see that this dethatching machine is bringing the thatch to the surface nicely. And then we want to rake that thatch off and put that in our compost pile. And here you can see where they used another type of machine. They had a little renovator on their tiller, and that moves pretty slow. And so they lowered their mowing height. They went out there with this machine. They went and dethatched the lawn. They pulled that off of the lawn and put that in their compost pile. And then they went out and fertilized. And if they had to do any core aeration, they could do it after that time. And the core aeration would be to break up the soil. They went in 2 different directions, perpendicular to one another, so that they could remove more thatch. And this is not grass clippings. Remember the difference. Grass clippings go right back on the lawn. They break down within a day. Thatch does not break down within a day because it has a lot higher carbon content. So it's going to take a long time to break down. So that's why you put it in your compost pile. Do not put it in the garbage. Put it in your compost pile. So dethatching, we're going to break up that material. We're going to rake it off. We're going to lightly fertilize with about a ½ pound of actual nitrogen per 1,000 square foot. It's going to look a little rough after you do any kind of core aeration or dethatching this time of the year. So you're going to give it time to bounce back. Usually within a couple weeks of fertilization and irrigation, it's going to start to bounce back. If you need to do any overseeding, you can do it at this time after you remove that thatch, because you're now allowing those seeds to penetrate down with the dethatching machine so that now they can penetrate into that area and you have good seed contact with the soil. This is a core aerator. This is another machine that we can use this time of the year. And you can rent these machines or you can have someone do it for you. What it does is it removes plugs in the soil and brings those to the surface. And what it does is it allows the soil to expand. So if you've had a lot of compaction over the years, and you have nothing but weeds growing all the time, then this is the right time of the year to do core aeration. And what I'd probably recommend is you do the dethatching first, pull that off the lawn, then do your core aeration, spread it around, put your fertilizer down, and then go ahead and you can overseed in that material once you're done if you want to overseed. So it's best to dethatch first, rake that off the lawn, and then go ahead and do your core aeration. And then you run something over the surface just to break up the plugs after you're done. And if you need to add lime at that time, you can do it. If you need to add fertilizer at that time based on your soil test, you can go ahead and do it. If you need to overseed at that time, you can do it then, and then just make sure you drag something over that after you're done to cover up the seed so the birds don't get to all your seed. And if you core aerate a couple years in a row, which you may have to do if you've never core aerated and you've got a lot of severe compaction problems. How do you know if you have severe compaction problems? Well, it's hard to get a shovel in the ground, or if you go out to take your soil test and it takes all your body weight and all your neighbors standing on the shovel to get it to go down into your soil, then you probably have some compaction problems. So, and especially if it hasn't rained in a while and you get like an inch of rain or so, you should be able to take a regular Phillips screwdriver and drive it all the way down into the soil. If you can't do that, that's called the screwdriver test. Very, very creative name for that. And if you can't drive that into the ground easily, then you know you've got some compaction issues and you're going to need to do some core aeration in those areas. Any questions on that so far? So you want to break up those core plugs. Many people will have somebody else do this because it's a lot of work. But you can rent these core aerators and you can rent the dethatching machines. And I've done this many different years on my own lawn, so I know how much work it is. And I've overseeded. And when I have a really bad year where the weather is just horrible and, you know, based on the global climate conditions and issues we're facing, we may be in for some more tough summers. You're probably going to be doing more renovation work in the future, so you need to learn how to do that. And then any questions on that? Because that's really the most important thing to understand of today's lecture is the renovation and some of what we talked about so far.
Two big questions, Bill. You did talk about the timing and things like that. Somebody did want to repeat what causes thatch, just to go over that one more time about what causes thatch, and then what comes first, lime, fertilizing. And
okay, great questions, everybody. Thatch can be caused by overwatering, where you have excessive growth or you have areas that aren't getting enough oxygen. So either the roots or the crown tissue starting to die out. Thatch can also be caused by over-fertilization, so the plants are growing too fast and you have all this excess plant material that's starting to die out and it eventually becomes thatch. Also, if you're using excessive amounts of pesticides, you could kill earthworms that are burrowing up through and actually helping you to control some of the thatch as well. So they're all causes of thatch. So you want to avoid those. And what was the second question?
A timing on whether lime, and that's okay, timing on whether lime or fertilizer is first.
Yeah, so that really doesn't matter that much. You can lime anytime during the season and even the mid part of the season. Fertilization, I wouldn't fertilize at all in the summer. I would, if you have to sneak a fertilizer on in the early spring, you can. And then the rest of your fertilization, if you put one or two fertilization treatments down, put them down in September, like beginning to mid-September. You might want to put another one down in mid to late October, and that's it at that point. Use slow release materials encapsulated that release it over a period of time. Don't put down highly acidified fertilizer, especially if you've got acid soil already. So take a look at what you have. If you are going to use more acidification or acid fertilizer, then go ahead and make sure that you are using lime at the same time based on your soil test. So it doesn't matter what you put down when, and you can even put down lime and fertilizer right when you're seeding in the fall. It's not going to hurt your seed. We've done it many times in our research and other blocks. It germinates fine with the fertilizer there. Just go ahead and, but if you can adjust things and do it in the order of doing your dethatching first, and then if you have to core aerate that, do that next. And then if you want to apply lime and fertilizer, you can go ahead and do that, and then do your seeding after you're done, and then drag something over it to cover over the seed. So hopefully that's helpful to you. And that's really, those are the big things I wanted to get through in this lecture, because those are the most important things for you to understand this time of the year in terms of your control. Any other questions on that?
Just not so much about the particular lime. Somebody's asking a difference between pelletized lime versus fast acting lime. And I know that there is difference in limes.
Yes. So I would always use pelletized lime, because then you're not breathing it in. Lime is going to break down quickly anyway. As soon as moisture hits it, it will break down very rapidly. It's calcium carbonate, water soluble. I recommend that you put it down pelletized, because it's easier for you to distribute it without breathing it in and out, without it flying all over the neighbors' yards and covering your dog that you just walked in the bathtub. So it's going to fly all over the place if you use the quick acting lime. So just use the pelletized. It's easier for you to measure, to distribute, and it's going to work fine. And then if you're, low in other nutrients, sometimes you need to add dolomitic lime. So it depends on magnesium level. So you look and you follow your soil test, and your soil test is going to tell you whether or not you need to use regular calcitic or dolomitic lime.
And I think I found in the trade is mostly a lot of dolomitic lime, which has the magnesium. So some of us here on the coast may not need. It's a little harder to find the calcitic lime. So just to give people read the bag.
Right. So if you need magnesium, and magnesium is involved in a lot of the physiological processes that protect plants from disease and mostly disease organisms, but you'll find that a lack of it is a problem. And make sure you have enough of it, and you'll see that when you take your soil test. So I think I'm going to stop there, because that's a good stopping point. We're at 7:57. If you have any other questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
And I know
I wanted to get through renovation, and I think we got through the overseeding. And if anybody has questions about that.
Yeah, the big things, I'll look and see about overseeding, but we'll see if any more pop up. But we did have a couple of weed questions about taking care of weeding. Patty, I didn't know if there's any, since I've been doing the talking. I didn't know if there's anything else you saw that popped up a little bit more.
There's actually a bunch of questions about weeds in the lawn, and we did put the fact sheets for nutsedge up, and we put the fact sheet for the broadleaf weed control measures. But somebody is asking if they need to do that, how long do they need to wait before they seed after they use those controls?
It depends on the chemical. Some chemicals will respond relatively quickly. For instance, when you use Roundup, sometimes it takes 7 to 10 days or more, depending on which formulation of Roundup or Finale that you're using. You want to spot treat with that. The new research out on that, just so people know, is that it is a safe product. The EPA and many others went back in and did an extensive review of Roundup. And as long as you follow the label directions to the T and you use it as recommended, it's actually safer than even some of the organic products that are out there. So it is, as long as you follow labels, it's fine. But to reduce weeds in general, what we say to do is you got to encourage dense turf, and you got to reduce compaction issues. Otherwise, you're going to have the same weed problems every year. You also want to increase your mowing height, because I know Joe Heckman and others did studies a while ago where they changed the fertilizer regime and the mowing height regime, and they were able to reduce over a period of years and also reduce compaction problems. We're able to increase the amount of turf grass and decrease the amount of weeds. So that will happen, but it takes time. But there are products that you can use out there. And these are some of the common weeds that you find, everything from the plantain #1 to chickweed to clovers, which I said clovers are really not as big of a problem, to #5, which is dandelion, where you've got to get the entire root out. See, you didn't think I had all these pictures, but I did. I just didn't know how much time
I love
I
it.
have. If you really want to get rid of dandelion, the middle to the end of October is the best time to use something like a Roundup and just spot treat the dandelions directly. You can actually even use a weed wiper where you're just wiping those weeds. And then make sure you keep your animals and pets and people off of those areas so they're not walking across the lawn where you've added Roundup, because Roundup kills everything that it touches, weed wise. But it is a systemic, and if you apply it in mid-September to the beginning of October, it will take care. It'll actually go down into the taproot of the dandelion and pretty much control it for the next season. You can also use organic materials that are out there, but the organic compounds that are OMRI approved, and OMRI means that it's Organic Materials Research Institute. So that means they've done work with it, and they've shown that for organic growers in general, we don't have the same standards for organic landscapers, but it's what the organic farmers use. But there are OMRI approved landscape materials as well. So if you look for those with OMRI, that means they're approved. The only problem with the OMRI approved products for organic landscaping is that they only kill the top of that dandelion. They're not going to kill the root. So that dandelion is going to keep coming back and coming back because it's a perennial. And some of the other weeds are going to come back year after year too. So you got to be careful of what you use in terms of using it properly, spot treating certain types of materials, especially if it's a non-selective like Roundup. You only use that on specific areas where it's labeled for certain types of weeds, and you got to be very careful with it. Other types of OMRI approved products, you can't use those on the lawn either on all areas, because if it says non-selective on the label, it could be a pelarganic acid or some type of acetic acid product. So it's going to burn back the weeds and also burn back your grass. So even with the organic products, you got to apply them just to the weed and not to the grass. So you're going to spot treat them. Broad spectrum products like 2,4-D can be used, but they can be used when you have flowering earlier in the season, and they control broadleaf weeds only. They don't control grasses. But you have to read the label and you have to follow the fact sheet very carefully if you're going to use those type of products. You can also use corn gluten very early in the spring when you first start to see forsythia start to just turn yellow, even before it blooms. That means that your soil temperature is getting to the point where crabgrasses and other annual weeds are starting to germinate. And that's where you could try to use some of the corn gluten materials. The only problem with corn gluten is that in some areas, when you put down enough corn gluten to control your weeds, you're putting down too much fertilizer in that area. So then you're violating your fertilizer recommendations for those areas. So with every problem, there's a solution and there's a problem that arises again. So you got to read labels, make sure that you talk to your master gardeners, identify the weed in question as to whether it's an annual or perennial, figure out whether or not just by increasing the mowing height of your lawn and doing the things we talked about today over a period of time, you're actually going to dramatically reduce the amount of weeds you have by adjusting the pH, by mowing higher, by irrigating early in the morning, by dethatching and core aerating, and by systematically controlling and spot treating for weeds. So hopefully this has all been helpful to you. And I guess we'll see you at one of your future classes at some point.
Yeah. A great, thank you, Bill, for a great program. There are still some questions that were not answered. So Patty and I will work on answering those and getting answers back to people because it is hard to ask with a large crowd every question because it's also
Okay.
specific to some people.
Well-
So I want to really just thank you so much for your time and your knowledge. I always learn something new.
yeah.
And yeah, and I didn't know about the new Roundup. I mean, I know Roundup for myself, but for the public, they're surprised to hear that it's
I will
safe.
actually send you the latest research articles that have come out. There's
Good.
quite a few of them, and they do show that there's a larger margin of safety than what we even originally thought, because they did a lot of
Awesome.
the past 4 to 5 years. Anyway, have a great night, everyone. I'm going to go eat dinner. And everyone enjoys their evening, and take care.
All right. Thank you again,
Thank
Bill.
you so much.
Sure.
Great
Thank you,
talk.
everybody. Have a great
Bye-bye.
evening, and we'll see you Houseplants if anybody would like to join us September for our September program. Thank you again, everybody. Good night.